Hello everyone. Was a bit stuck for video ideas, and because I didn't want to go too long without making another one, I decided to do a video on the difference between anarchism and socialism. Now, going off if you've seen my previous video, you'll understand that both anarchism and socialism want to reach communism, which is a moneyless, classless, stateless society. Basically, a society or a world where everyone works for each other's benefit. There's no money, no a hierarchy, nothing like that. Anarchism and socialism are two different types of communist thought, you could argue. The primary difference between the two is the existence of a state, which is here going to be revealed or used with a square. Now, a state, and this is an important distinction for understanding anarchist thought, a state is not the same as a government, here represented in a circle. A government is the system via which large groups of people are directed and how they make decisions. So, for example, a government would be, or could be, anything from a liberal Western democracy as we understand it, or a bunch of local farmers gathering together and deciding what they want to do. Government is just people making decisions for their group as a whole rather than exact individuals. Not all anarchists technically believe in government as a thing and believe that each person should make completely individualized choices, but that's a whole different topic I'm not going to get into now. A state, however, is a different thing. A state is characterized by a few things, but basically it's a government, like government plus, basically. So, whereas a government is simply making choices for an entire group of people, a state is exerting control over that group of people to a far larger degree. So, for example, government is people saying, we want to do X thing, we nominate XYZ people in order to carry out our expressed will, whereas the distinction between a state would be one person or a few people going, we want people to do this, and we're enforcing our will to do it. One of the most easy to understand distinctions is governments don't necessarily need employed police forces, or what anarchists refer to as monopoly of violence, in order to exert their will, because a government is, in an anarchist or socialist setting, elected by the people, therefore fully accountable to them. Therefore, the government shouldn't really need to enforce its laws because the majority of people will enforce them by itself, or enforce them with what small institutions exist. Anarchist government is characterized by a number of things, including the practical abolition of money, or at the very least its abolition to a large extent, the complete collectivization and democratization of workforces or workplaces, and a mass emphasis on individual freedom. Admittedly, a lot of socialists do share a lot of these ideas, but to different extents. For example, anarchists don't believe in having a centralized military force. They believe in I'm generalizing a lot here, but they usually believe in decentralized, democratic institutions, and in the case of a military, militias. So you wouldn't have police, you'd have various members of a community who band together and work and live and function together effectively, and they just so happen to be responsible on one specific week or one specific day for enforcing those laws, and then they shift with someone else, or in a military context, rather than generals or leaders going to some rich fancy officers' school and then being appointed from above by the government to control troops. The troops or soldiers elect their own representatives who then become their commanding officers, and all very democratic effectively. Whereas socialists still believe in the establishment of a government, the establishment of a state. So socialists would still believe in government appointing generals, high courts ruling or wielding complete power, the existence of a police force, centralized military. They don't necessarily believe in these things, but these are characteristics of a state which most socialists would support, or at least did back when a lot of the old theory was being written. Nowadays, especially with regards to police, there are less differences, and it's not uncommon to see socialists and anarchists of certain stripes working together nowadays, but historically that hasn't really been the case. So socialists effectively believe in a government functioning within the state. Now that government is almost always democratic, so an elected body or an elected assembly. Whereas anarchists believe in taking government out of the state and restoring it to popular control. So you'd have elections every 1 to 2 years, you'd have a lot of control over how things are implemented and over local affairs. There wouldn't be centralized military or police, so the government can't enforce its will on people. There's a lot of emphasis on individuality and individual freedom, and sort of allowing or creating a cultural environment in which individuals work together for the common good. The most common example of a socialist state and government is important. They're not communist, because communist doesn't have a state. A socialist government, the most famous one, is, of course, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was created by Lenin. Interestingly, originally it had a lot of fairly communist elements in it originally. There's an American journalist called John Reed who wrote a book called 10 Days That Shook the World, which was about the Russian Revolution and the overthrow of the Tsar. And in that book he writes that a lot of the officers and a lot of the generals who were leading those armies were directly elected by their men, or their men held more or less democratic control over their decisions, and that almost created a culture in which their officers feared the men or their troops, rather than a culture in which officers were the domineering, controlling forces in their soldiers' lives. The most well-known, or at the very least the most successful example of anarchism was a type of anarchism called anarcho-syndicalism, and syndicalism is a name well known to anyone who's ever played Kaiserreich, but more importantly, it's a form of anarchism based around trade unions and utilizing cooperative worker power through unions to, among other things, overthrow capitalism and install a system in which the workers' interests are directly represented. The most famous example of this went on for about a year in revolutionary Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, which effectively, Catalonia is a country in northern Spain currently occupied by the Spanish government. And after Franco, who founded the modern country of Spain, rebelled against the government of the Spanish Republic, the government, or the Spanish central government from Madrid, among other things, disbanded the armies and ordered the creation of workers' militias. And Catalonia really, really took that to heart and came under the initial control of the Party of Marxist Unification, or the POUM, which was influential, but less. But it primarily came under the control of these organizations here, the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo and the Federación Anarquista de Iberia, which I have almost certainly mispronounced. Apologies to anyone who can speak Spanish. These are the National Confederation of Workers and the Anarchist Federation of Iberia. And they took over the governance of Catalonia. They collectivized workplaces. Basically everywhere was collectivized. In some places, money was abolished and replaced with barter systems, vouchers, stuff like that. Those examples are rare, and money was used throughout most of Catalonia, but it still definitely happened. And in fact, the FAI, the Federación Anarquista Iberia, produced some of the best quality troops and some of the best weapons used by the Republicans, the side fighting for the Republic, in the Spanish Civil War. And in an interesting trend from history, they only really lost because of, if you can look down here, the repression of the CNT and POUM. Effectively, the Spanish Communist Party, which was backed by the Soviet Union, these boys here who disliked anarchists a lot, took control of the Spanish government and began, in an absolutely tactically brilliant move with no potential repercussions, began slaughtering their allies, imprisoning more than slaughtering, but backstabbed their allies, arrested their leaders, broke up their militias, and completely collapsed their front line, effectively. And this took up resources, this took up some of their most elite troops, and as a result, revolutionary Catalonia collapsed and fell to the Communist Party in Spain, which at the time, and in something of a theme with a lot of communist parties throughout the 1930s, was very much in bed with the bourgeoisie. Which, for anyone who's not aware, bourgeoisie, effectively, it's a term with a lot of complicated history, but effectively it means the people who control societal resources and the people who control societal capital. For the purposes of socialist discussion, rich people, the 1%, factory owners, all the sorts of soulless Jeff Bezos types who ruin people's lives to make their own fortunes. And the communist parties in France and Spain at the time were very much sort of conciliatory towards the bourgeoisie. The communists got elected in France and they didn't bring about a workers' revolution. The communists came to power in Spain and they cracked down on forces like the POUM and the POUM and the CNT, who were fighting the war under the tagline, "The war and the revolution are inseparable." They cracked down on the social changes and economic changes carried out, which caused the collapse of anarchist government in Catalonia. This has been a bit more theory-heavy and probably a bit less well-defined than my previous video, because I'm not as much of an expert on anarchist and socialist theory than I am on the differences between socialism, communism, and capitalism, which is part of the building blocks of being a leftist. But just to recap, anarchists mostly believe in government, that is, people deciding to do something, and often but not always appointing representatives to get it done or to represent their interests for a period of time while getting what they tell them to do done. So anarchists don't necessarily believe in a world without leaders or a world without leadership, but they believe that all leaders should be elected, fully accountable to their people, and basically that decisions, especially important ones, should be far more democratized, and that leaders shouldn't be able to live the rich and luxurious lifestyle that they lead today. And quite importantly, that no government should have the power to completely enforce its will unless people actually want what it's doing. By contrast, socialists often believe in some kind of state, and admittedly the lines between state and government are blurry, but effectively states are far more centralized, far more formalized, and often have centralized military and police forces to enforce their will and enforce their decisions. And whether or not those laws are enforced, or whether or not what society wants to happen are enforced by those systems, is often the result of a coin flip, which is one of the arguments anarchists and socialists have. Now, anarchists and socialists and what constitutes government and what constitutes state and the differences between them is a bit nebulous. For example, I consider myself a syndicalist, but I still believe in the existence of a state-like entity. But at the same time, I don't believe in centralized military or a centralized police force, effectively. I still believe in a lot of decentralization and a lot of direct democracy, which are, at least in modern times, still very anarchist ideas compared to mainstream socialists, like these guys. So yeah, the line can be blurry, but effectively, government decentralized, very democratic, very little, if any, police or centralized military forces. If there are, it's basic law enforcement in the form of regular people patrolling their neighborhoods to make it safer, as well as obviously social initiatives, housing, food, stuff like that to tackle crime. And a military would be workers' militias. You could argue that it could be centralized and have some sort of elected command structure, but not to the rigid extent of modern militaries. States enforce their will using police and centralized bureaucratic regimes. They have big professional centralized militaries. They have lots of power, and their decisions are predominantly made by figures within the state: parliament, prime minister, members of cabinet, etc., etc. Far less of it is decided directly by the people, whether that be policy implementation, when to implement policies, how to implement them, how to enforce them, whatever. Most of those decisions are taken away from the people. Again, this isn't a perfect definition by any chance, and I very well might revise this video, but that's basically what I understand the distinction between anarchism and socialism, or more accurately, government and state, to be. There are, of course, more differences, but I want this video to be somewhat watchable in length, so I'm not going to go into those here. And also I need to do more research before I can be properly authoritative on all the differences.